All right, so this is HEVC Revisited. For those of you who've been regular attendees, we've talked about HEVC over the years. When we started way back in 2013, it was more along the lines of this is a great new technology, but its time hasn't quite yet come. Fast forward to the end of 2015, the cusp of 2016, the technology is getting there. The implementations are getting there, the end-to-end workflows are getting there. We've had a couple of hiccups here and there, but as you'll see, the conversation is now shifting to one of, what's the best strategy, what's the optimal way of implementing it. It's not really a question of when or whether or why anymore. First of all, let's just get a few logistics out of the way. So why is my opinion somewhat worth listening to? I'm part of the research team at Frost & Sullivan. I have colleagues here as well. We cover all the markets around video, data, and software from glass to glass. And specifically, I cover encoding, transcoding, content protection, delivery, and CE devices. So the findings you see here are drawn from a number of conversations with vendors across the board. We look at it from a number of different perspectives. And over time, our predictions have sort of been, by and large, on track. And so, we're happy to continue to share these. This is the outline of the talk today. It's somewhat different from the ones we've done in the past in that we're going to start with our predictions and go forward from there. This isn't really as much about, let's be sane about the process. It's more about here's what the industry is doing, here's where it's going, here's what our recommendations are. So 2015 has been, by and large, a good year for HEVC. We've seen very decisive implementations, and by that I mean not just, let's do a beta test, or let's do a trial run, or let's do, a 100-viewer stream for press reasons. These are actual implementations. We've seen them in the Far East. We've seen them in India and China. We've seen DTT in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we're expecting to see larger rollouts within North America and Western Europe through, if not the end of 2015, definitely by 2016. And this is important because there's a large legacy problem in North America and Western Europe where you have the luxury of greenfield deployments in other regions. Here you're doing a wholesale replacement. And so this coming of age is actually starting to be seen. We have metrics. We're mostly seeing 4K happening at 50 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 20 to 30 megabits per second for sports, about 12 to 15 megabits per second for VOD. Those are fairly decent numbers. They're not as high as they were even a year ago. You're still getting very good quality. Mostly we're seeing the use of main 10 profile. It may be HDR, it may not be HDR. That's still a bit of a wrinkle, but it's getting there. We're seeing the most use in contribution distribution and in OTT. The OTT is predominantly greenfield or where you're sending it to special purpose streaming devices or dongles. Contribution, again, is easy because the ratio of decoders to encoders is fairly small, so it's very easy to swap out an entire system. The telling sign for me is that we're starting to see professional decoders available. Very often when you start these deployments, you'll just be running servers with monitors to play the signal back. By the time you have professional decoders entering the market, you know that the end-to-end is starting to get into shape. HDR high dynamic range is still a bit of a mess, and that's an understatement, but there's a lot of people committed to sorting it out, working on it, figuring out the backward compatibility, setting the stage for future deployments. And so, we expect to see that sorted out, and in the meanwhile, we can start to see deployments. And again, like I said, the important thing for us is we're starting to see conversations shift towards optimization, not so much about timing, and that's a very good sign that a mature inflection point is just around the corner. On the flip side, HEVC Advance, with its new royalty terms, has definitely thrown a wrinkle. I have some survey results towards the end of the talk, but we have seen tangibly dampened momentum. And that's where I think where we should have seen a rapid sort of inflection point ahead of the Olympics in 2016. We're now saying we're going to see it closer to 2017, 2018. Not to say that it's going to derail HEVC entirely or that it spells doomsday. It's going to take some time for everything to fall into place, for the conversations to happen, for the risk to become quantitatively analyzable, for people to wrap their heads around it again. The Open Media Alliance, which is everyone familiar with the Open Media Alliance? You guys heard of it? Okay. From our perspective, that's not so much, H.264 versus MPEG-4 video part 2, act 2, scene 2. We think it's more a tangible shift in the center of power of the video ecosystem. This used to be, a very broadcast-centric, a very patent-centric, a very memory and CPU-aware industry, very focused on latency, very focused on density. We're seeing this as a shift towards an IT-centric paradigm, where you've got infinite computation in the cloud, where you've got tech companies who see video as a first-class citizen, as a first-class data form, and they need to get rid of a lot of the patent regimes, a lot of the unpredictability of future innovation. So this might be, a long-term trend where we start to see parallel codecs and parallel standards organizations. For now, we don't really see, VP9 replacing HEVC. We'll get to that in a minute. 4K remains in the experimental stages. That's a little bit slower than we had anticipated. We do still have gaps in terms of DRM support, in terms of adaptive bitrate online video platforms. We think these will all start to be closed over the next couple of years. The interesting thing we've seen this year is that a number of companies, both on the library side and the product side, are telling us that if they throw enough computational cycles at AVC, AVC being a fairly mature technology, as of now, the compression gains of HEVC and AVC are moving in lockstep. Okay, so HEVC is still a little bit early in its implementation. The number of tools being used are relatively few. AVC is extremely mature. Over time, those graphs will diverge because AVC will get to a point where you can improve it no further and HEVC will continue to grow. But for the time being, AVC is getting better also, and that's buying operators and vendors time to sort out the HEVC issues while still getting better bandwidth. Finally, you still have a limited choice of vendors. So for those who are in the market, super price points are high. For those who are looking for competition, scalability, some choice in end-to-end implementations, it's still a little bit of a problem. Not as bad as it was last year, though. So these are our predictions from last year. These more or less stay the same. You'll see that we've pushed our predictions out by about a year. That's the impact from the HEVC advanced licensing. We do have encoder vendors predicting a bumper year for MPEG-2 next year. We expect this will be the last round of refreshes of MPEG-2. Might be famous last words. I really think it's going to be the last round of refreshes for MPEG-2 before we start to move on to AVC and then on to HEVC. But we are seeing already HEVC becoming the first choice for closed-loop applications, whether through set-top boxes or through dongles or through streaming media devices. And we absolutely expect to see competition by 2018, maybe still by 2017, but definitely by 2018. So this is sort of one of those myths versus reality slides, and there's no scale here. It's just a relative indication. But a lot of people have been equating HEVC with 4K, and the real purpose here is to say that HEVC has applications beyond that. So when we talk about infrastructure gap, we're talking about everything. Is the content available, the encoders, the decoders, the quality assessment, the transport, the metrics, the rendering apps, the analytics. When we talk about ROI, it can be in terms of top-line gains. You can charge more revenue. You can gain more subscribers if you can reach more of them with HD, or you're lowering your bottom-line expenses in terms of bandwidth costs or operational costs. The longer the arrow, the higher the momentum we expect over the next couple of years. So as you can see, 4K broadcast, next generation DTT will take time to roll out. The gaps to be closed in terms of infrastructure are larger, more expensive. With cloud DVR, with contribution encoding, these are more controlled systems. They tend to have software clients, fewer decoders. Those are expected to kick in much faster. And then, of course, there's mobile OTT. HD plus broadcast is HDR in the context of HD, 60 frames per second in the context of HD. HEVC does yield significant gains there, and you have to switch out the set-top boxes anyway, so it helps seed the 4K ecosystem as well. And we're seeing a lot of interest there. So the next few slides are just numbers. It's been a while since we've put up these updates, so I figured it was time. The key takeaway here is if you ignore smartphones, which if you're looking at long-form content, our belief is you make cast from a phone, but you're not really going to watch it there. It's your smart TVs, your tablets, and to some extent your set-top boxes and game consoles that are going to be the key consuming devices for 4K, for HEVC, for HDR style content. We had 5 billion devices deployed at the end of 2014. We had 3 billion new devices shipped. So that's at least half of the devices deployed are legacy. And of these, less than 500,000 were HEVC enabled in 2014. So there's going to be some gap for old devices to catch up with new ones. That you want to interpret as your pool of devices that still need to get HEVC content. The real takeaway here is that when HDR is resolved, when next generation DTT does kick in, you're still going to have a legacy problem. And so AVC isn't quite going away, but HEVC can be used more and more over time. One of the issues we've been seeing specifically with 4K was a lack of content. That continues to be an issue. With the Olympics, there's also a lack of interest in licensing content because the ROI is a little bit difficult to define as of now. And we had done some very detailed calculations on ROI at Streaming Media East in May. Those presentations are still available, or you can ask me for a copy. This, I thought, was interesting because you're starting to see, a build it and they will come kind of investment from those who are creating the content and from vendors who are invested in building an end-to-end ecosystem. So this is 4K P60 NASA content. It's available through a satellite. The encoders, the decoders are there. There's a choice of software and hardware players for playback, and it's a beautiful demonstration of the ecosystem starting to fall into place. It's also somewhat of a symptom in that they're still seeking pay TV licensees, so it's not yet commercially available. It's in the sky for those who want to start to access it. And it's also available as channel as a service. This is another deployment. This was in India. Tata Sky is a joint venture between Tata and 21st Century Fox. And in a cricket-mad country of 1 billion people, what better way to monetize it than to send it out in 4K. The contribution encoding in Australia was done with quad AVC encoders. We're still seeing that happen quite a bit for reasons of latency, for reasons of cost, just for ease of backhaul. We expect over time that's going to turn into a single encoder, but for now it's quad AVC. That was then transcoded to HEVC with elemental transcoders. This was an 8-bit stream, not 10-bit, and it was 50 frames per second at 25 megabits. The interesting thing for us was that the set-top boxes were being sold for $100. So you now have a seed footprint of 4K set-top boxes that are indigenously manufactured from those who had actually used the service. They found it quite easy to use. They liked the user experience. And again, this is sports content and satellite driving it forward. A quick set of context here. When we at Frost & Sullivan look at the encoding and transcoding markets, we have the M&E, the media and entertainment industry, which is on the left. That's broadcast encoders, contribution, backhaul, DTT, pay TV, which is IPTV, satellite, and cable, and then your multi-screen and production transcoders. So the HEVC revenue forecasts that I'm going to be showing you on the next slide are that left half over there under the M&E encoder and transcoder industry. It does not include enterprise encoders, and it doesn't include any of the end-to-end platforms, so no OVP, no EVW kind of webcasts. But this is the first year that we've actually numerically sized HEVC revenues. We're still not talking about market shares because the numbers are small and they're somewhat fungible at this point. But as you'll see, you're starting to see the inflections. 2017 is really where we're expecting it to take off. Pay TV encoders, we're not expecting to see grow as a significant market. We expect that will be in the form of transcoders. So transcoders close to $1 in $5 is going to be HEVC by 2019. And then broadcast and DTT encoders are slated to grow as well. The numbers are significant in a sense because you're seeing HEVC revenues slated to grow about 15x at a time that total industry revenues will only double. On the other hand, in contrast to a $2 billion revenue projection for the total industry, HEVC is really under $250 million. And what that means is if you're early to market and if you have really strong products, you'll make money here. Otherwise, you're probably better off waiting for 4 or 5 years until the silicon's available, until the high volume sales kick in. You can really start to get some profit from volume, if not from margin. So with that, the question is, and we always get asked this, well, should I be using VP9 instead of HEVC? It's open source, there's no royalty. My answer to that is typically video is only one of several components in your workflow. So you have to think about the video, but also the DRM, the adaptive bitrate, which isn't quite there for HEVC, the audio, the advertising. As much as you have workflows live in VOD for HEVC, we're not seeing that supported in the advertising ecosystem as much yet. And then you have to worry about your playback metadata and analytics. So you have to put all of that in context when you're starting to switch codecs. The easy answer from our perspective is even up until 2016, unless you're doing 4K or unless you're really, really stuck on bandwidth, you're better off using AVC. You may want to upgrade to the latest versions of AVC, the most efficient implementations. You want to look very carefully at your presets. A lot of times we have folks coming in and saying, well, I just put a pre-filter in front of my encoder and it works great. Well, it would have worked great if you changed your presets too. And so it's really important to use your encoders as effectively as you can. And that said, there's costs and benefits. So you will get more compression efficiency. You will get a better QoE with state-of-the-art HEVC. But you can get a lot of that at lower risk and lower total cost of ownership in 2016 with HEVC. This is a slightly more in-depth analysis of the different codecs. So if you look at suitability for HD, HEVC is good at it, but the trade-offs are fairly significant as of now. AVC is better suited to HD at the current point of time. Once you get to 4K, then it's pretty much a no-brainer. You have to use HEVC. You can use VP9 in several contexts, but if you're doing broadcast or if you're doing pay TV, if you need set-top boxes, typically the operators will choose the safer route from a patent licensing perspective. Even given the madness of HEVC Advanced, they will choose to use HEVC versus VP9. In terms of browser device footprint, VP9's on all the Android devices. It's on a growing number of alternative devices as well. HEVC is, as of now, the smallest, but it's growing steadily, and AVC is fairly ubiquitous, so that's not an issue. In terms of choice of vendors, AVC is by far the widest choice of vendors. VP9 is probably the smallest, but it's starting to get very quick traction, especially in the face of ongoing uncertainty with HEVC, and also given the establishment of the Open Media Alliance. We're starting to see DRM clients incorporate VP9. We're starting to see end-to-end workflows incorporate VP9 as well. HEVC is, it's a reasonably strong set of vendors. There is a good bit of marketing fluff out there, so, caveat emptor, buy your solutions carefully, evaluate them well before you choose them. But that ecosystem will definitely grow over time. Licensing risk is a bit of a perceived issue here. So with AVC, it's crystal clear. There's no perceived risk. With HEVC, there is absolutely risk perceived as of now. Partly because they're not quite sure what the final dollar counts will be. So we've had funny stories trading around where folks are interpreting the revenue, the content 0.5% license to mean that it's a ratio of HEVC bits shipped to total bits shipped. And I've had someone half serious, half jokingly tell me, well, we're going to leave our MPEG-2 streams on so that the ratio of HEVC bits comes down so that the content royalties come down. But there's the B2B licensing scenarios aren't quite clear. There's a good bit of risk involved. Until that comes down, that's going to be an issue, but we do expect it to come down. We've heard indications from the licensing folks themselves that it's going to get more reasonable, at least more transparent, and it's going to be modified to a point where people can expect to be compliant with the terms. One of the big issues we see, for example, is the lack of caps on royalty, because with open source software, WebRTC, for example, you simply have no idea how many clients have shipped, so that's going to be a problem as well. And then in terms of standards and ecosystem support, AVC is by far the most mature. HEVC is getting there. VP9 is probably the furthest behind. But again, we're expecting all of those to improve over time. Net-net, the two important things to keep in mind is, again, if you use state-of-the-art AVC encoders, Intel has Visual Compute Accelerate right now. Xilinx is supposed to be coming out with chips. There's software on the current the latest set of CPUs in Blade servers and high-volume servers that can give you very, very competitive performance. you're going to have to throw similar computational resources at HEVC as well. It is about 3 to 4x more complicated to encode HEVC than it is to do AVC. So with the same amount of CPU resources, you can, as of now, get similar bandwidth, and that's where that's coming from. The other thing is in terms of licensing risk, we tend to say, well, VP9's open source, Google has indemnity, there's no problem. When you talk to broadcasters or when you talk to vendors of broadcasting equipment, they don't see it the same way. They see safety in the HEVC in the MPEG regime. They don't see safety in the open source. And there is absolutely zero willingness in that community to invest in VP9 for broadcast infrastructure. So as much as we're saying, there's no licensing risk with VP9, there is a perceived risk, and it's a strong one. Talking about share of wallet, how high is HEVC on the general priority list? It's starting to get up there. As recently as maybe 6 months ago, it was in the experimental bucket. It's starting to move out of there. We're hearing reports of hundreds, if not thousands, of trials. We're expecting sales of close to 500 to 1,000 encoders in 2016. Those are fairly decent numbers. The key challenge, however, that the operators have is in terms of increasing their OTT service reach. It's in terms of increasing quality, and most importantly, it's in terms of increasing profitability. We're not seeing profits in OTT yet, outside of very, very few niches. Live sports is one example, or a couple of other niche areas. It's just the profits aren't there because the advertising revenues aren't there, the analytics aren't there, the volumes aren't there, the choice isn't there. That's pretty much priority number one for all service providers. To the extent that HEVC supports those goals, it's a priority for now. Otherwise, it's aspirational, not critical. Higher broadband speeds are perceived to be a much more critical investment. It's mostly from a marketing perspective, because honestly, everyone has enough broadband to get a couple of HD streams into their home right now anyway. And then cloud DVR, where you're disintermediating, either broadcasters are disintermediating pay TV providers, or pay TV providers are trying to go to deliver managed experiences on unmanaged devices. For all of those, cloud DVR has shot up quite a bit in terms of its level of priority in budgets this year and next year. And we're projecting fairly strong growth rates for that. Again, HEVC can help make cloud DVR more effective, but as an independent technology, it's somewhat lower on the priority. 4K, as of now, we see it more as a marketing tool than we do a revenue generation tool. For DTH, for sports, it may actually generate revenue, but by and large, it's a marketing thing. And uncertainties in technology and licensing are absolutely adding to the delays there. So with that, we're almost at the end, and I realize we're all in a post-lunch coma here, so I'll try to push through this as quickly as I can. These are my ultra-scientific HEVC poll results. I interviewed the massive sample size of 15 vendors, none of whom I knew personally. The questions were objectively chosen. There's no bias of my perception whatsoever. But here's sort of where if you were to do a finger in the air test and say which way are the winds blowing, here's where it is. When you ask about VP9 being a viable alternative to HEVC, the answers I get is they're context dependent. So there's not as much resistance to using it for OTT as there was even as recently as last year. For broadcast, it's almost always a resounding no. And in general, the answer is it's somewhat unlikely in that the technology is great, but it's perceived to be backed by one company. Now, in the context of Open Media Alliance, again, that may shift quite a bit. Has the licensing uncertainty derailed HEVC adoption? Oddly enough, 1 in 3 said not really. I was not expecting that. But there are some companies who said that they've seen absolutely no slowdown in sales or in deployments or in plans. Typically, these were vendors who were serving the satellite community or vendors who were serving the consumer electronics devices community. There are some vendors who said it was by 6 to 12 months, and then about half say that it was derailed by at least a year. So instead of hitting the Olympics cycle, it's going to hit the FIFA World Cup cycle and the Summer Olympics cycle, 2017, 2018. No one thinks that 4K will be delivered without HEVC. And that was quite a bit of a surprise to me also, because I did expect at least some people would say, yes, you can do 4K with VP9 or with quad AVC or with some contraption. Folks were unanimous. If you're doing 4K or higher, you're going to do it in HEVC. In terms of remaining glitches, HDR is on a lot of people's minds. HDR is is everyone familiar with HDR? Cool. Okay, so that's pretty much the only thing, and there are different standards in play. I will leave it to the Ultra HD, either Alliance or Forum. One of these days I will get it right, to talk about where that's going. There are several panels that are going to be discussing the backward compatibility issues. But as we've seen from the case studies here, you can have viable services without HDR also. And so there's different ways to go about it. HDMI in terms of the revocation lists, in terms of the bandwidths required for the full 4K P60 is still considered a bit of an issue, but standards are underway to fix that. And then the licensing uncertainty is also considered a glitch. So the big question was sort of, what's going to be the year of HEVC? It was supposed to be 2016. It's not quite happening. Opinions mixed between 2017 and 2018. Personally, our sense is it's going to be holiday season 2017 ahead of the series of World Cups and Olympics in 2018. That's where, if you recall, our transcoder revenues start to shoot up as well. That's the inflection point for the HEVC devices as well. And then as of now, already most people feel that decoding silicon is available, despite the other uncertainties. So this is across set-top box, across tablets, across smart TVs. The general perception is, both from a security perspective and from a codec perspective, the decoders are there, and that's a very, very good sign. All right, so on to closing thoughts, and then we have plenty of time for questions. We are still more or less saying the same thing that we were saying 6 months or a year ago. As much as HEVC is an interesting buzzword, pick your battles. Right? You're running a content business. Your goal is to delight your customers and to be profitable, to maximize ARPUs. To the extent that HEVC helps you get there, by all means embrace it. To the extent that you can use other less disruptive means, use those first. The biggest challenges when we poll operators are still monetization, profitability, churn, the threat of online services, the demise of TV by appointment, the need for discoverability, the absolutely non-negotiable need for managed experiences on unmanaged devices. That needs to be done first. Scalability is important. You don't want to be a victim of your own success. You have to be able to scale to millions of viewers if you have content that goes viral. And you have to be able to differentiate. In a world where everybody is licensing the exact same content library, and most people are picking from 3 or 4 middleware and app vendors, how are you going to differentiate except on price? And that's where the winners and the losers of the content services are going to be picked. In the short term, in the long term, you want to move towards HEVC. In the short term, I think I've beaten this drum enough. Best of breed AVC encoders with optimized presets can get you huge gains already. Cloud-based converged workflows are a great way to reduce your bottom line. You don't have to have separate workflows for your managed bouquet streams and your unmanaged OTT streams anymore. You don't have to have on-premises workflows. We've done a number of ROI studies that show the gains that you can have by switching to the cloud. Invest in personalized experiences consistent across devices. The more content that is interesting that your consumers find, the more time they will spend on your service. And finally, we're still seeing that if you can renegotiate your CDN pricing, you can cut your bandwidth bills in half without changing codecs. So with that, I'd like to thank the many companies. Not all of them are mentioned here, some withheld by request, but thank you for taking the time to share your opinions with us. And we continue to blog and post data, so you can find us on any of those sources. Are there questions? Yes.
So HEVC had a second version that came out that addressed scalability. Oops, sorry. So HEVC actually had a second version that came out that addressed scalability. What do you see as the chances of content services or broadcast or anything using scalable HEVC?
So the question was, what are the chances, or what is the interest in HEVC in terms of the scalable video coding that was released? I haven't seen a whole lot of pickup. So we spoke to some of the companies who had actually proposed some of those technologies. Even they aren't quite ready to use it. From what I understand, and some of this is still proprietary, but it's extremely complex to encode scalable video streams. It's complex enough to do HEVC in baseline. It's even more complicated to do it scalable. And at this point, there seems to be more interest in just getting the end-to-end workflow running for some kind of bit rate, then getting ABR to work, and then maybe starting to focus on scalability. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Hi, Eric Rabb from New Line. Can you go back to the one slide that had the device deployment numbers? And you had a caveat on there about that couldn't be upgraded or something. I wasn't quite sure I understood what you were saying there.
Yeah, and I breezed through that one. My apologies.
That's the one. Yeah, so I wanted to kind of look at that a little bit closer. It's also hard to read some of the numbers on that one just from the distance I'm at. So
yeah,
can you have a little more commentary maybe on just this slide, I think?
Absolutely. So up until last year, we were reporting HEVC capable device numbers, and those were significantly higher than these. What we mean by HEVC capable is that even if it doesn't ship with hardware accelerated HEVC decoding out of the box, it's capable of running a software application reasonably optimized to decode video and has a decently long battery life to support. So typically we would say, okay, if it can play back HD video for 2 hours without a battery recharge, we'd consider it HEVC capable. Now that we're sort of grown up, we've switched to the harder HEVC enabled metric. This requires that HEVC is natively integrated. In other words, that you can also implement DRM on a fully trusted hardware path. That is, by and large, and there are several DRM experts nodding their heads here, so I'll defer to them. But you need to have hardware-based decryption in order to access the 4K content, so there's that. And also battery-efficient encoding and decoding. So under that slightly more stringent metrics, the numbers start to come down a little bit, but we believe these are more reflective of the ideal of having a managed content experience on an unmanaged device. You can still get HEVC to decode via software on additional devices, but this is the enabled device count. And I will say that this is us, predicting in 2015 what's going to happen in 2018. I mean, I don't think in 2010 anyone expected the iPhone to come along and turn everything on its head, or even in 2013 we did not expect the Chromecast to cross 10 million device shipments in 2014. So this is a risky forecast. If HEVC for some reason dies a miserable death, the encoders will be in the chipset, but they will not be enabled through software. And we've seen some of that happen with the iPhone after the HEVC advanced licensing. On the other hand, if HEVC takes off, there's not a large barrier to entry for a lot of these device classes to put it in. So, this is indicative. Take it for what it's worth. It's a conservative estimate of C-enabled devices. Questions?
Andrew Sachs from Volacom. You said at one point bandwidth wasn't necessarily the problem. Many of us can get megabits to our home or multiple HD streams. The reality isn't just about that loop, right? It's about the interconnect that they have back to the providers. Doesn't HEVC give those, I'll call them streaming platforms, the ability to not have to raise those rates? Even though consumers may be able to get multiple HD, it doesn't mean that it can come from Netflix to your house.
You're absolutely right. So the question is, are we really in a bandwidth glut, or is, bandwidth a constraint? And the common sense answer you would expect to that question is it is a constraint. I was talking to several operators right after Streaming Media East in the summer. And they unequivocally, all of us told us they were more interested in raising quality than they were in reducing bandwidth consumption. And so the motivation they all stated for HEVC was to get better quality, not lower bandwidth. Now the caveats to those are three. One is if you're in a multiplex, the cost of overflowing a multiplex if you raise one more channel to HD is extremely high. And so in those cases, that even if you can get a 20% reduction with HEVC, it's worth it. The caveat there again is if you use a state-of-the-art AVC encoder, you can get 25 to 30% better too. And so you can get, for the same computational complexity, equivalent bandwidth gains with and without HEVC in 2016. Over time, that equation is expected to change. And a lot of that will depend on how quickly vendors innovate and how quickly silicon innovates. As of now, we're not seeing a very, very compelling argument to say you're going to save tens of millions of dollars if you switch from AVC to HEVC. If you can give me your card after the talk, I actually did the ROI calculations at the previous streaming media talk. The numbers have changed a little bit, but not a whole lot. I think the conclusions still stay the same. So over time, you're right. There will be a need to bring down the bandwidth in order to rein in costs, but not so much with HD as when you start to get a large number of 4K channels. And there's, I think, if I can find, this is a survey we had done of chief information officers and chief tech officers of media and entertainment companies. These are the 4 priorities they said they had in expenditure: management, protection, transformation, and monetization. Reducing backhaul costs wasn't in their top 4 list, and that's why we keep coming back to, yes, it might be a priority, but where does it stack up on the list? Just not that high. Any other questions?
Coming.
Hi, I'm Mark Donegan with Beamer. My question about the number of HEVC-enabled devices in the market, how many of those are able to implement any sort of security? So, it's great, it's got decode capability, but if it can only play back unsecured assets, I'm going to assume for most of us in the room, that means it's not going to work. So curious if you've gone to that next level of analysis.
I have, if I'm spouting nonsense, I have 2 people who I know will keep me honest. There might be others. So on the Android devices, you almost always now, if it has the resolution and the CPU horsepower, you have at least Widevine level 1 built in at a hardware level. If you're talking about iOS, they've had the trusted execution environment for years. If you're talking about Microsoft devices, they also have the PlayReady SL3000 moving forward. If you're looking at the gaming consoles, most of them have pretty decent security on them. I mean, Xbox is better than Nintendo. Xbox is better than PlayStation, is better than Nintendo, but they're there. The IP streaming devices are probably the most suspect of the lot. That's also why, if I go back to that, we have their numbers the most delayed. If I can find that slide. So the lower teal little blips are the IP streaming devices. There are dongles that are being purpose-built for HEVC 4K decodes that have the requisite level of security in them. If you're talking about a Chromecast or a Roku today, they don't, but I think over time they will. And then with tablets, similarly, it's the same Android iOS equation. You do tend to have those. The bigger challenge, I think, comes with it's one thing to decrypt the contents. It's another thing to fully manage the DRM on it and to have a portable player that can handle it. It's coming. The DRM vendors are cognizant of it. The general playback vendors are cognizant of it. And so it's coming. Any other questions? Super. Well, thank you, everyone, for your time and attention. If there's anything else we can help with, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to write, call, tweet, email, anything at all. Thank you.